Joining us on the pod today, he is a reporter who covers energy and climate change for Vox. I also think he is one of the smartest and best thinkers on climate change. David Roberts, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
So the National Climate Assessment Volume 2 is out. The Trump administration tried to bury it over the holidays, but it's here. It's pretty bleak. What did you learn from the report?
That's it's sort of funny, following this area for a long time, these reports come out with great regularity, and they haven't changed a whole lot since they started coming out. So for me, at least, who've been paying attention to the previous reports, I didn't learn much of anything. I mean, all that happens with a new report is the numbers get a little worse at the margins, but the basic message is the same as the last report and the report before that and the report before that.
Right. So because the IPCC put out a report in October
Exactly.
that had similarly dire warnings. What is the value of a report like this when the gap? When it's not as though the problem we have right now is that those who believe we need to act don't understand the stakes. It's that there's political and economic barriers to action.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think a report like this, which is, a really deep dive by U.S. federal agencies, 15 of them, I think, worked together on this report, would be extremely helpful for an administration that is geared up to do something about this, to help them sort of guide and shape their efforts. But as to its usefulness in persuading anyone, I think at this point, anyone who's persuadable by a report has been persuaded. So I really honestly don't know what the usefulness of another report like this is. I would like to see all these reports shift toward solutions, shift toward solving the problem. Like at this point, I think everybody who's open to hearing that it's a problem has heard.
Well, to that, there's one, I agree with that, but one aspect of it I did think sort of, struck a chord with people anyway, is that the report is very precise about long-term economic impacts and says that as much as 10% of, it could hit as much as 10% of U.S. GDP by the end of the century. We've seen Republicans, including some of the more supposedly serious Republicans, oppose action on economic grounds or suggest that regulation isn't the answer. You've said that the idea that addressing climate change would hurt the economy is every bit as nonsensical as the idea that climate change is a hoax. Do you think that this kind of sort of specific number, 10% of GDP, will help cut the legs out of that argument?
Well, I wish it would, but no. I mean, first of all, it's worth saying that 10% of GDP by the end of the century is the very, very, very high end. I mean, I think if that was the median projection, that might cut through, but there's only so precise you can get about these very long-term economic projections. But at this point, like the exact numbers don't matter so much as if this thing is going to, if the economy is going to be hurt, as they say, worse than the Great Recession, and we know this is coming, the idea that it's expensive to prevent that kind of disaster is just sort of conceptually incoherent. Almost by definition, we would have a lot of trouble spending enough money to cost us more than climate change is going to cost us.
Right.
That's the point.
It's also a bit tinny to be talking about sort of global dislocations and massive immiseration on the scale of billions of people in terms of, trade deficits.
One thing that's always worth noting about these reports is a lot of the most sort of grim human damage isn't going to have that much impact on GDP. I mean, the sad fact is, like, hundreds of thousands of poor sort of Southern Africans could die in heat waves, and it wouldn't move the needle all that much on global GDP, but it would still be worth avoiding, it seems to me.
So that seems right. So let's talk about let's talk about what we can do. We have this, proposal for a Green New Deal being pushed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other progressives. What did you make of it?
Well, I have mixed and complicated feelings about it.
You seem to have mixed and complicated feelings on virtually everything.
Yes, that's right. So on the one hand, I mean, it's fantastic. It's not, and I don't think it's meant to be, any kind of detailed policy roadmap. I mean, if you look at the sort of bullet points on it, each one of those bullet points is itself an enormous national undertaking. That would involve dozens of policies. I mean, it's less a policy program than a sort of marker. Like, this is what a real solution would look like. And in that sense, I think it's a fantastic development. I mean, it's the first time that a solution on the scale of the problem has been put on the table by a political actor, like in Congress. It's the first time an adequate plan has graced the halls of Congress.
But someone willing to state the goals, right? The actual goals being on 100% renewable in a short time frame, that sort of thing.
Right. It says, for instance, decarbonize U.S. transportation. And that's great. We really do need to do that, but that's, that's going to involve more than a single bullet point. So, I mean, I think it's great to have that as a marker for people to rally around. People who want to do something adequate now have a sort of, place where they can plant their flag. As to the sort of political maneuvering and how to push the Democratic House as far as possible on this, that's going to require, I think, it's going to require more than righteousness. Let's put it that way. It's going to require some savvy. It's going to require knowing who has the power and who can do what, and sort of what are the sort of limitations of the possible. So I just hope that people within that movement are deploying their savvy behind the scenes as much as they are deploying their sort of righteous outrage in the press, which is, obviously a justifiable part of all this.
Well, I would say, look, one piece of the sort of public campaign for something like a Green New Deal would have to be shifting what is possible, right? I mean, the last time we made a big push on climate change, Democrats, this was during the Obama administration, Democrats managed to get something through the House, which was an incredible achievement by Pelosi, viewed as a tough vote for a lot of Democrats. It ended up dying in the Democratic Senate. Even getting all Democrats on board took a ton of compromise along the way. How do you see the politics of this changing? I mean, it's going to require more than it. The reason we didn't have a stronger bill then is not because we lack the savvy on the part of those pushing for climate action.
Right. Well, like Henry Waxman, I think is the person you'd want to give most credit for that to. And there was nobody more savvy in the House ever than Henry Waxman. And I think if you look at the sort of Waxman-Markey deal, or the Waxman-Markey bill that got through the House, in 2009, that is what sort of the median position on climate change in the House looked like then, and it was pretty conservative. But as you know, the Democratic Party was considerably more conservative back then. So the party has moved left. We will find out how much. I mean, I think people really need to understand just how radical this proposal is. I mean, the proposal that she has put in front of Pelosi would demand that as a precondition of this committee forming in the House, it would completely decarbonize electricity, provide a federal job guarantee for everyone in the U.S., spend hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is as far left as you can go. I don't think the median in the House has moved nearly that far left, but this is a good way, as you say, of sort of like sounding out how far left has it gone. So that's what we need, is sort of a modern day Waxman to find the limits of the possible, to find out how much, sort of the suburban Democrat in, Topeka or whatever, like how far is he or she willing to go.
So all of that very difficult task is still an intra-democratic task.
Correct.
That you're describing. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but Republicans control the Senate and the White House.
What?
So, I think people feel pretty hopeless about climate, in part because they look at this and they say, all right, even the good faith actors, some of whom have their own sort of more prurient motives, but nonetheless, the collection of on the whole, good faith actors coming together might be willing to potentially do something that could be on the way to doing enough. And yet, there is this rearguard action, this group of conservatives in the United States standing in the way of not just American progress, but also, to some extent, to global progress. What do you say to people who feel that sense of hopelessness?
Well, I mean,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I say,
I'm giving
what's
you
your
the
alternative?
question. Right? Yeah.
What else are you going to do?
This is
What else are you going to spend your days doing?
I'm sorry.
So,
It's a very
I
hard
mean,
question.
this has obviously been a central problem for climate politics in the U.S. since it started. The Republicans are immovable. So, the question is how to move them. And what has been tried for decades now is reasoned persuasion. That's what all these reports are. I could point you to just billions of words patiently sort of explaining the science, blah, blah, blah. That didn't work. It's not going to work. I think at this point, it's clear it's not going to work. So what's the other way to move politicians? If persuasion doesn't work, the other way is fear. So the only road I see to moving some Republicans on this is to make it good politics, make it popular, make it so that they're scared not to come along. And to do that, you can't do that with these sort of backing into the future, halfway incremental Waxman Markey style, sausage making. If you want the politics to be popular, if you want people to rally and make and create some genuine grassroots enthusiasm and passion about this, you have to go big. You have to give people a big, clear vision. So, I mean, that's what the Green New Deal is about. It's obviously not going to pass in this Congress. I hope I'm not saying anything controversial when I say that, or probably any Congress anytime soon. But it might shift the politics and create some real grassroots energy around this. And then eventually, Republicans, what remaining Republicans are in sort of purple districts and purple states, and even, sort of renewable energy is invading red states, like eventually they'll just be scared not to get on the bandwagon, and that's what will bring them along. So if if you feel sort of this sense of hopelessness, just like double down and go forward faster. Like that's the only thing that could possibly work.
So it seems like there's, in terms of how inevitably the conversation about climate change becomes a conversation about how we talk about climate change.
Yeah.
And
Oh God, believe me, I know.
So there's been all kinds of thought about how to do this. You need to make people feel like it's solvable. You need to make people feel like it's dire and an emergency. It needs to feel like a national security threat. What is your thinking on this right now about what Democrats should be saying differently than we're currently saying on this issue?
Yeah, well, first, a meta note on that. You're right that climate change politics have been dominated in the U.S. by discussions of language and framing, and I think that's a sort of symptom of the fact that this came out of science, and scientists want to explain things to people and persuade people, and it hasn't been working, and so they just analyze and analyze and analyze how they're talking. But the reason action is not happening on this subject is not that people are not saying the right words. It's not some magical phrasing that's going to shift things. It's power. It's fossil fuel interests have a lot of power and money, and so changing that requires counter power and money. No amount or variety of talking is going to substitute for that work. It's power and organizing that are going to change things. And sort of that said, I don't think. I think. I've cycled through a lot of opinions on this subject, but I've sort of come back around to, I think we're talking about it mostly fine. It's a giant problem that's already beginning to manifest. It's going to get worse and worse and worse until we clean up and decarbonize. So let's decarbonize. I think that's a perfectly fine way to talk about it. Like danger to our fellow Americans and future Americans, looming serious danger seems like a great motivator to me, and it has motivated a lot of people. Like majorities of Americans want to act on this. Majorities of Americans support renewable energy and they support alternative energy. Like Americans are more or less persuaded and on board for action. It's not persuading ordinary Americans that's holding things up here. It's concentrated power and money at the elite level, and the only thing will change that is counter power and counter money and organizing.
So one thing I was just curious to talk to you about. The IPCC report makes this clear. It's sort of often almost an aside in the discussion that that's keeping global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees will require some form of negative emissions.
Yeah.
You've written about this. On the one hand, it's seen as like sort of this far off technology, and yet on the other hand, it seems like it's essential to any or the vast majority of reasonable estimates for how we could keep global temperatures from rising too high. What are your Can you just tell people what negative emissions are and what the status is on these technologies?
Sure. I mean, the basic frame here is that climate change is a concentration problem. It's about the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so the rate at which you're emitting doesn't really matter physically. All that physically matters is how much of the gases are up there. And so the idea is if we want to limit temperatures, it's going to be really hard to prevent concentrations from rising above the level that we would think would produce 2 degrees, but then we can crank the concentrations back down by pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And we can do that with new kinds of agriculture, with reforestation, with different kinds of soil, but we can also do it with machines. Like we built these machines now that will directly suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then you can bury it. So, I mean, I think the thing to say about that is getting to the point that we're going negative requires first getting to zero. So, I mean, it's great that people are worried about the sort of what we're going to do in 2050 or 2080 with negative emissions. I'm glad we're looking ahead to that. But the first task is doing all the stuff we know reduces emissions now at economically positive returns. So I would just say we need to have our eye on that. It's definitely, we need to be doing R&D, we need to be doing testing, we need to be thinking about how to construct a giant continent-spanning network of burial sites where we can bury tons and tons of CO2. It's all that stuff needs to be researched, but we've got plenty of work ahead of us before we get there. Like maybe we could like raise the gas tax, before we start talking about like burying gigatons of CO2 or dimming the sun or all these sort of crazy things we're coming up with. We could just like raise the gas tax first.
Listen,
let's take things one at a time.
I think that you and your fellow anti-Snowpiercer zealots, I want to get so much carbon out of the air that we cause an ice age, the mammoths come back. All right.
Well, also, this is all premised on the idea that like we can turn the entire Earth system, sort of up and down, like we've got hold of a knob. And I don't know that I want to bet the future of the species on that.
It's like we have to turn the whole machine from suck to blow. That's basically where we're at.
Right. We should just try restarting.
One last question, then we'll let you go. Thank you so much for your time. Are you hopeful today?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've gone round and round about that question so many times also that I sort of come out like, what does it matter? Like, what does it matter whether I see a big dangerous problem. I'm doing everything I can to sort of explain it to people and raise warnings about it and talk about how we can solve it. Whether I have hope or not is not going to change whether I do that work. The work is the work, like I have hope in the sense that I know that there are thousands and thousands of people of goodwill out there in America who are also doing the work. So that gives me hope. As to like trying to predict some outcome in 2100, don't waste the mental energy. Just do the work.
David Roberts, thank you so much for joining. That was great.